While Hollywood hasn't always had the best track record when it comes to depicting Black history, or minorities in general, as time's gone on, there's been a definite increase in the amount of diversity we see on screen, especially when it comes to biographical films. Though while most of these films are based on American history, in 2022, Sony Pictures released The Woman King, a film about the agogie, a group of female warriors from the West African kingdom of Dahomey, and their fight to gain independence from the Oyo Empire. Though, does the film do justice to the legacy of these incredible women? Let's take a look and find out. So, while I am incredibly happy that this movie exists, the bulk of the story and most of the characters, with the exception of King Gezo, are fictional, which makes sense considering that most of the knowledge we have on the Kingdom of Dahomey, most of which was recorded by Europeans during the mid to late 19th century, is fairly limited. Though even with this limitation, the filmmakers were still able to cobble together a pretty realistic depiction of how these women would have lived, including details like, sorry, before I move on, I want to give a quick note on terminology, as there was a bit of confusion, on my part, as to what the warrior women of Dahomey were actually called, as most of the sources I've read refer to them as agogie, meaning wives of the king, while the film refers to them as agogie. So instead of choosing one or the other, I'm going to take the coward's way out and refer them by their other common name, the minnow. Nabe's forced conscription, where she's given to the king by her adoptive father, is unfortunately historically accurate, as women who were considered to be too disobedient or unruly were often given to the king as warriors, which, despite what we can assume was a fairly high mortality rate, was likely much more liberating than the life of a typical woman in Dahomeyan society. In addition to being subject to the will of their fathers and husbands, women in Dahomey were also responsible for most of the manual labor, from planting and harvesting crops to rearing children and taking care of livestock. The minnow, on the other hand, were not only free from these burdens, reportedly spending the bulk of their free time drinking, dancing, and smoking, they also occupied a very honored place within Dahomey society, as it was common practice for people to clear the roadways whenever they entered town, and may have even averted their eyes out of respect for their position as honorary wives of the king, a fact which the film does reference. Just like in the film, the king was known to recruit war captives for his army, as one of the last Minnow warriors, a woman named Tatagachi, was originally a war captive taken by the Dahomey army, though it's unknown if these women were given the opportunity to return home like in the film. It was actually pretty common for the Minnow to take human heads, though rather than selling them at the market, like in the film, at the end of each campaign, the king would purchase enemy heads from his soldiers. It's also true that only the Minnow were allowed to live at the palace, as, excluding eunuchs, no man but the king could stay in the palace overnight, a tradition in which some scholars believe might be tied to the Minnow's origins, as it's possible that they were initially employed as night watchmen and bodyguards before being introduced into the king's army, though this is just a theory. The uniforms depicted in the film are in keeping with the descriptions of European explorers like John Duncan and Frederick Forbes, both of whom claim that the Minnow wore a uniform made of a striped sleeveless overcoat, shorts, and some kind of head covering, though some sources claim that the Minnow's uniform actually varied depending on which unit they belonged to. Like their film counterparts, the Minnow underwent extensive military training, including unarmed combat, rifle training, and learning how to wield a sword and machete. Traversing barricades made of thorned acacia branches was also a common part of the Minnow's training, as it was believed that exposure to pain would make them fearless and resilient, which, given their reputation on the battlefield, seems to have been pretty effective. The Blood Oath, where new recruits are forced to drink each other's blood to mark their entry into the army, is only mentioned in a few sources and should probably be taken with a grain of salt. The kingdom of Dahomey did in fact worship a pair of male and female deities called Mabu and Lisa, a practice which may have led to the creation of the dual court system, where each male officer worked in cooperation with a female officer. Though, due to a lack of information, we know very little about how this dual system of government worked, especially regarding what the officers did and how they worked together. While it's true that the Kingdom of Dahomey secured its independence from the Oyo Empire, a powerful kingdom in southwestern Nigeria, in 1823, the film fails to mention that Dahomey's victory was greatly impacted by the occurrence of the Yoruba Wars, a series of conflicts that engulfed the Yoruba-speaking areas of West Africa, which severely weakened Oyo's army and led to the empire's collapse in 1835. Though King Gezo did take control of the throne from his older brother, King Adandozan, in 1818, it's worth mentioning that the coup did not result in Adandozan's death, and that stories of his brutality may have been exaggerated by his detractors, particularly foreign merchants and slave traders, who he was known to occasionally imprison and sell for ransom. However, one thing we know for sure is that King Gezo's beliefs regarding the slave trade differed considerably from what we see in the film, something which I plan to talk more about in the next section. Unlike in the film, the Kingdom of Dahomey did not, as far as I know, have a tradition of dual male and female leadership. Though, according to oral tradition, there was a time when the kingdom was ruled by a pair of siblings, King Akaba and his twin sister Queen Hangbei. Unfortunately, this dual rulership didn't last, as in 1708, while leading a military campaign against the rival kingdom, King Akaba ended up dying of smallpox. Worried that news of his death would destroy the army's morale and potentially cost them the war, the queen decided to dress as her brother and lead the army in its place, essentially becoming the first warrior queen in Dahomey's history. After achieving victory, Hangbei continued to rule Dahomey on her own, and may have established the Minnow to serve as her bodyguards. Though, if this is true, it would seem that the Minnow ended up outlasting their founder, as Hangbei was quickly usurped by her younger brother, King Agaja. While the film ends with King Gezo denouncing the slave trade, this didn't occur until 1852, almost 30 years after the film is set to take place. The slave trade, while horrific by our standards, aligned quite well with the warlike nature of the Dahomey kingdom and the already established tradition of ritual human sacrifice, where prisoners of war were sacrificed each year during a celebration referred to as the customs. While the kingdom's devotion to the tradition of human sacrifice definitely helped endear them to the slave trade, when England began pressuring Gezo to abolish slavery and refocus his efforts on agriculture, he was understandably hesitant, remarking that they were a military people, the Dahomeyans, and of course unaccustomed to agriculture pursuits. He could not disgrace himself and subject himself to be laughed at by sending the woman from his palace yard to plant and cultivate cotton. Though Gezo was eventually strong-armed by the British government into signing a treaty banning the export of slaves from Dahomey in 1852, this unfortunately did not last, with the practice resuming just 5 years later in 1857, though it's uncertain if this was Gezo's decision or that of his heir apparent, King Galele, who, after becoming king, reversed many of Gezo's policies. Unfortunately, despite their victory over the Oyo Empire, Dahomey's independence did not last into the 20th century, as during the 1890s, the kingdom entered into a series of wars with France, which led to them becoming a French colony in 1900. The loss of the Franco-Dahomeyan Wars also led to the abolition of the minnow, as those who survived the conflict were unable to serve as warriors in the new colony. A sad reality which makes this film, and by extension the telling of their story, so important. If you want to find out more about the minnow or the Kingdom of Dahomey, then feel free to check out any of these sources I have listed in the credits, and I hope to see you all next time.